the official student group of the Dole Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we will have time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. Now, before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Assistant Director and Senior Archivist for the Dole Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Thanks, Victoria, and this is an amazing crowd. Some of you might be aware of a very important sporting event that's going on right now, and yet you are here, and so that means that you are really excited about this program, and we're so glad that you're here. I'm Audrey Coleman. I'm the Assistant Director and Senior Archivist at the Dole Institute, and I'm so pleased again to have you all here, and with my colleagues in the World War I Centennial Commemoration Committee. We've had such a good time over the last several years doing programming together, and I was just reviewing what we had done a few years ago beginning, and was pleased at not just the number, but the nature of what we have done. We brought in a scholar, KU visiting scholar, to do some classroom engagement with collections here. Our four-part presidential lecture series in 2017 was dedicated to the U.S. in World War I, and I'm sure many of you attended that as well. Just last month, the World War I committee helped us bring two scholars here to use our collections and study the Armenian genocide, help us prepare educational modules that we can use to teach here at the Dole Institute. And today we've got this great panel of KU staff and faculty and students to share their research with you. So this has just been so fun and fruitful, and I'm just grateful to Laurie Van Sheena for her support and leadership, and Nathan and Jennifer and all your help over the years. So. I think I'll leave it at that and introduce Laurie Van Sheena, who's the chair of the World War I Centennial Commemoration Committee. Thanks.
Thank you, Audrey. We appreciate the opportunity to hold today's World War I Centennial Commemoration event here at the Dole Institute of Politics, and we thank you, the Student Advisory Board, and the staff members here for hosting us today. I also thank Jennifer Duhamel and Jessica Irving for their unending support for our programming. Our moderator today is Nathan Wood, Associate Professor in History and an indispensable partner in our efforts to turn our attention these past 4 years and that of our students in the broader community to the Great War and its significance. I have long waited to hear these colleagues and students speak about their research on World War I, and I thank them and Professor Wood for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Laurie, it's a real pleasure to be here. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself when we're done with this commemoration committee. It's been a real professional and academic pleasure for me to be part of this. I'm very proud of what KU has done, and it's in no small part thanks to your leadership and your commitment here at the Dole Institute. I'm also very excited to introduce the scholars whose work we're going to hear about today. With many of you, I've had a chance to sit in some of these committee meetings, and I'm so excited to hear their presentations. What I'm going to do is just introduce all of the panelists at once. They'll each sort of go in turn as listed in the program, then you'll have an opportunity for questions. I think I've been asked to come up here and sort of moderate the questions. That may or may not be necessary. We'll see how that works. But without further ado, please let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Howard Graham serves as the Associate Director for First Year Experience and directs the KU Common Book. He helps to administer Learning Communities, First Year Seminars, and the First Year Experience Peer Mentor Program. And I feel very fortunate to work with Howard in a lot of those programs in the Office of First Year Experience. He earned his bachelor's degree from Colgate University in History and English, and the work he's going to present today is from his master's thesis here in American Studies at KU, and he's currently a PhD candidate in Education, Leadership, and Policy Studies. And he's presented this work at the International Sports and Society Conference. Nicole Perry is Assistant Director at the Center for Undergraduate Research. She earned her PhD from KU in Sociology in 2015. Nikki, as she's sort of better known, supports faculty and staff in their roles as research mentors and instructors. I've benefited from that support. She began working on this research for her doctoral degree, which she completed in December of 2015. Since then, her research has been featured on NPR, in the Topeka-based television series Sunflower Journeys, and most recently the online history platform Timeline. Holden Zimmerman is a German Studies and History major and a European Studies minor. I deeply regret I haven't had a chance to teach you, Holden, but I was very pleased to give a guest lecture in a class and very impressed with your questions, your incisive questions and comments at that guest lecture. Holden has studied abroad in Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. She currently is the Nonprofit Administration and Development Intern at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and she plans to pursue graduate studies in museum studies at KU. And finally, Matt Dunne, whom I did have the pleasure to teach in my World War I class, is a history major, European studies co-major, and a French minor. Matt is the editor of the Undergraduate Research Journal in the Humanities. He's recently presented his research in Topeka as part of the Kansas Undergraduate Research Day and has been selected by the dean to be the college student banner carrier for this year's commencement ceremony. So an esteemed group of scholars, and I'm very excited to hear their presentations. We'll turn the time now over to Howard.
Thanks, Nathan. Howard Graham. It's a pleasure to be here. As Audrey said, it's a wonderful crowd today, and I want to start by thanking Laurie and the World War I Commemoration Committee for asking me to be here, and to also thank Audrey and Sarah and Bill and the wonderful staff here at the Dole Institute of Politics for all of their work. I teach undergraduate students on campus, University 101, a course I formally directed, and I try to bring my students here every semester, and the staff here does a great job welcoming, accommodating, and working with undergraduate students, not just here in the hall, but also in the archives. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I do some speaking on campus at orientation and during Hawk Week and at other events. I maybe do 50, 60, 70 public speaking events a year. And so my comfort level is in storytelling. So I kind of want to start with a story of how I came to my research. And it's tied up in Common Book, and it's tied up in the World War I Commemoration Committee. So a few years back, when we were looking at picking a common book, and we often look at trying to tie Common Book to events that are happening on campus. I was part of the World War I Commemoration Committee. The campus was gearing up for years-long programs around the commemoration of World War I, and we had the nomination of Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. And we chose Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms partially because it tied so well into the commemoration planning that was happening. So it gave our undergraduates the opportunity not just to read a book over the summer, work with the book in classrooms, but it tied into a lot of different programs, so many avenues of entrance. And at that time, I put out a note to many faculty on campus, basically asking, what are your favorite books on World War I? And one response came back to me that said something to the effect of, well, I don't have to tell you about Paul Fussell's book on World War I. Well, of course they did. I had never heard of Paul Fussell, embarrassingly, and I went and I bought Fussell's book, The Great War and Modern Memory, I think the title is. And as I was reading that book, something jumped out at me that I hadn't realized in full. And this book is written from the perspective of the British war effort in World War I, is that the role that sport played in the war for the British side. Fussell basically posits that you can't understand World War I without understanding sport. In a nutshell, and some of you may have seen, this has been in commercials before and in popular media, the role of soccer with the Christmas truce and other events where sometimes a soccer ball would be thrown out of a trench with the goal to score the soccer ball in the German trench. And his idea is that it was that pluck, that courage, that the British officers were playing on to get soldiers to come out of the trenches and rush time and time and time again into certain death. And so that triggered me thinking about, well, what is out there with World War I and sports in the U.S., in America? And I knew that Memorial Stadium here on campus was a memorial to those soldiers that had fallen, that had attended or were attending at the time the University of Kansas, as well as the Union and the Jimmy Green statue outside of Lippincott. And I came to this book, which I have here on the desk, that is called Gridiron Universities, actually published by the University of Kansas Press. And I became really astounded at the sheer number of colleges and universities, and I'm focusing on Division I, or what might be termed, or sometimes it's called FBS schools, football bowl subdivision schools. I was shocked to see how many schools had built memorial stadiums. So here is just an impartial list. And the reason I say it's impartial is because my research has focused primarily on the University of Kansas, but I've built this broader context. And in looking at other schools, it's sometimes, although it's sometimes difficult to discover their stadium histories. Fields get renamed. You have fields at certain stadiums, so they have two names, et cetera. And so I'm certain that there are other memorial stadiums out there that are no longer functioning, perhaps no longer standing, that I'm missing from this list. But a quick run through, you can see Cal, Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, USC, Illinois, Indiana, K-State, Minnesota, and Nebraska all built memorial stadiums in the wake of World War I, dedicated to either those soldiers who had fought in the war or soldiers who had fought and died in the war. And I got curious about were there other stadiums built in the period that didn't carry the memorial name and so therefore weren't dedicated to those soldiers who had fallen, and the list gets very long. As you can see, I think there are 38 schools on this list here, many colleges, and all of these schools, by the way, still play in stadiums that were built during this period. And so when I started to think about memorial stadiums, I began to think about those not just specifically dedicated to the war, but those that were built in the wake of the war, perhaps named for a high donor, or for a historic space, because to me they were connected to the war even if they didn't carry that memorial name. So as I was thinking about how to take 50-some pages of notes that I have down here that I've been working on in the university archives at the Spencer Research Library and compress it into 10 minutes, that's a daunting task, by the way. I really wanted to kind of focus on a few so what's with this. So what I'm hoping to impart with the last 5-6 minutes that I have is, why is this interesting? How did it happen? And why does it matter? So why is it interesting? Well, by my accounting with this list of schools here, and there are currently 109 schools that are in FBS, nearly 30% of the colleges and universities that are competing at that level today in 2018, nearly 30% are playing in stadiums that were built between 1917 and 1930. KU among those. And I got further curious and I went and looked at who has won the national championship in football between 1930 and 2017. And an astounding number, 81% of the schools that won a national championship between 1930 and 2017, 81% of those schools built stadiums in this period. So that's interesting for a couple reasons. One is many schools across the country their built environments date to the World War I, the post-World War I, immediate wake of World War I period. So World War I is still informing our built environment here at KU and at many other places. And it's interesting to me that, and I think I can say this, for the majority of the most successful college football programs in the country date their stadiums to this period. And as many of you probably know, and this wasn't said in my intro, but I did work in athletics here for 10 years as well. And prior to coming here was a coach. I've been involved in athletics my whole life. College football drives, I know we love KU basketball, but college football drives on a national scale, or on the national scope, the conversation about college sports. The realignment of the conferences, most recently, that's about college football. And so these are the reasons this is interesting. So how did this happen? And I'm going to outline just 6 quick facts or themes that I've pulled out of the archives in the university of how it happened at the University of Kansas, hoping to learn more about if these are the ways in which it happened at Oklahoma or Nebraska and other schools as well. But in the wake of World War I, there was this idea that physical education had been vindicated, that America's success or victory in World War I had somehow taken physical education or sports from this murky space where people were questioning its validity, on campus, or its validity to American identity, and it vindicated it. It saw this over and over again very quickly. This is from Chancellor Lindley. One result of the Great War is a nationwide recognition of the commanding importance of physical education. Many of you probably know that James Naismith served in the war with the YMCA in France, leading troops through physical education exercises. So that's something that is both localized and nationally. So coupled with that is that sports, and in particular football, were very popular and had been popular for decades. In the 1880s, there were tens of thousands of people, and this is, I take some of this from a secondary source, there were tens of thousands of people who would show up to college football games, especially on the East Coast and Ivy League schools, to see teams play. The Thanksgiving game that was often held at the Polo Grounds in New York starting in the 1870s and on would draw 40,000 or more people and marked the beginning of the winter social calendar in Manhattan and in New York City. When Ohio State opened their stadium, they had 70,000 people in the stands. And when KU had its first Thanksgiving game at Memorial Stadium against Missouri, a game it won, KU won, they had 22,000 people in the stands. So it's popular, and it's important. There was a growing student population, both here at KU and nationally, in this period following World War I. Just a quick fact from the Office of Institutional Research and Planning. In 1917, we had a student body population of 2,165 students. We nearly doubled that by 1930 with over 4,100 students on campus. There's also this idea, and I'm going to explain what you see here behind me in a second. There's also this sociological idea of isomorphism that is taking place at this time. And that's the idea that as other schools, well, there are different types of it, but mimetic isomorphism is that if KU is doing it, other schools are going to do it. And if other schools are going to do it, KU is going to do it. Kind of a social pressure with sports. And KU is looking to the east. And it's looking to the Ivy League schools. It's looking to Harvard and to Yale and to Princeton and to Dartmouth and places like that. And those schools had had football for some time. Their stadiums predated this period. And so KU, which is sending people out to look at those stadiums to decide what we want to build here, they're feeling that pressure to conform. And other schools actually checked in with us as well as we were designing our stadium to find out how we were doing it. So that social pressure was building nationally. We have a growing alumni base. We have a consumer culture that's growing. We have improved transportation, and I see that again and again in the research, paved roads that allow our alumni from places like Kansas City to come to Lawrence for games. And we have inadequate facilities. So the old wooden bleachers from McCook Field are not going to hold our increasing student numbers and our increasing alumni base that can more often than not travel now to Lawrence from places across the state or even in the region to see football games. There's also something that's happening that is absolutely vital, which is there's an amazing, I'm not sure this ever happened otherwise in the history of the university, there's an amazing coalition of students and faculty and administration and alumni and community members who have come together to support this. There's pamphlets from this period, 1920, 1921, that are meant to be fundraising pamphlets that have over 50 different contributions, quotes from former players, from current students, from administrators, from people at the Kansas City Star, from people that own businesses on Mass Street saying, we support the stadium. And so for these reasons, the importance of physical education, which is tied to a lot of different things, especially masculinity in this country. The popularity of football, the growing student population, the growing alumni base, the pressure to conform to what other schools are doing, the improved transportation, consumer culture, and this coalition that is being put together here, the stadium happens very fast. It's announced, the idea to build the stadium is announced in December 1919, and it is done by October 1921. The first game is actually against K-State, but the dedication comes against Nebraska a few weeks after that, with the third game being Mizzou. We did not win the dedication game against Nebraska. We won the other two games. So why is this important? And let me just point out, I'm sorry, I had to pare down my, this is Stadium Day, which speaks a little bit to the coalition. Reported over 4,000 people showed up to tear down the old bleachers at McCook Stadium. You can see some of these photos on the Spencer Research Library blog as well. Thanks to the Spencer Research Library for allowing me to use these today. And I'll point out just one other thing here. This coalition, and I said isomorphism before, is mimetic. There's also such a thing as coercive isomorphism. And what you see here, when I first looked at this, I couldn't really get my head around what it was, and I found a story about a student in 1919. I'm way over my time. I apologize to my fellow panelists. I found a story from 1919 where a student refused to wear a freshman beanie. Freshmen were required to wear beanies at that time, so a mob gathered and chased this person, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, into Fraser Hall, where then a melee broke out that allowed the person to, who was hanging out of a second-story window in Old Fraser to escape and run to the chancellor's office, where he locked himself in the chancellor's office and the mob grew outside. And the chancellor suggested to the student who had come in that he go back outside, and a deal was struck where they agreed not to paddle him, but to throw him in Potter's Lake, which is what they did. And it clicked for me then what this image is, and then found a later description of it. This is when they pulled the students out of bed who did not come to Stadium Day, did not show up to take down the bleachers, and they made them walk this paddle line, and they paddled them. So there's this amazing coalition. It's also coercive in a certain way. So why is this important? Then I'll be done. And I think that that's because to understand the relationship between school and sport now in 2018, we need to look in the past. And a lot of scholars and a lot of scholarship I've seen don't look as far back as this period in the wake of World War I. And I think that there may be keys in understanding how we have the university college sports structure that we have now in that period. A report came out in 1929, the Carnegie Report, that if you read it today, you would think that the NCAA or an outside organization wrote it in 2018. The issues that they had in 1929 in the wake of this building boom and the growth of college sports, we have today. It also is the period where colleges and universities changed the way that they interacted with the public by making themselves more accessible. When the stadium got built, it also meant that other events like orientation and like Traditions Night, the first Traditions Night happened in Memorial Stadium in 1924, that began to happen. So when I say political geography or landscape, what I mean by that is the stadium as a space where people come to express views, to declare loyalties, and to exercise those loyalties in relationship to the university. It is also the period when the university and the athletic department begin to separate from one another financially. And interweave financially. And so the keys to understanding athletics today on campus here and more broadly are in this period. And that's why I think these memorial stadiums, and my definition is more broad, or stadiums built in the period, the decade after World War I, this is the reason they are important. I look forward to your questions. Now I'll invite up Nikki Perry.
It's thinking about it, so I can go and get started. Okay, so my name is Nikki Perry, and today I'd like to talk with you about the legacy of World War I for sexuality and women's health in Kansas. So specifically, I'd like to talk about a law that was passed by the Kansas legislature in the spring of 1917. It was called Chapter 205, and the law itself was actually kind of boring. It wasn't really that interesting. It just gave the Board of Health really broad powers to quarantine people who had diseases. Where it got interesting was how it was implemented. So starting during World War I and then for a couple decades afterwards, it was primarily applied against people who had syphilis and gonorrhea, so venereal diseases. And it really was only applied against women and not men. So in this period, initially there were probably around 100 men who were detained under this law, and between the world wars there were over 5,000 women that the state of Kansas imprisoned for having syphilis and gonorrhea. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how this came about, a little bit about how it was implemented, and then I can talk about just a couple populations of women who were in prison that are kind of interesting. So, as the U.S. Built up for World War I, one of the main concerns of military leaders was the really high rates of infection of gonorrhea and syphilis among the soldiers that were enlisting. And as they tried to think about how do we address this, they considered some rather simple solutions like giving out condoms to the soldiers. Instead, opted for a more complicated plan of trying to first convince the soldiers not to have sex, and second, when that didn't work, imprison the women that they were having sex with. So actually, to tie in with Howard's comments and a KU basketball theme for today, there is a KU connection with this first part. So James Naismith did go to France with the YMCA, but also as part of that, he was actually charged with helping to develop the sex education campaign for the soldiers that were on the ground in Europe. And he had a team of about 8 lecturers who went around among the soldiers to try to convince them not to have sex. And you see posters like this trying to convince the soldiers to stay clean while they were abroad and not bring some of those diseases back home to their girlfriends and wives. So Chapter 205 really fits in with this second strategy a little bit more. So this law, the impetus for this came from federal pressures to have states implement laws like this. And so similar to Chapter 205, nationally, a lot of states pass laws like this with support from the federal government and the Public Health Service. So nationally, there were over 18,000 women who were detained in federally funded facilities during World War I. So what's interesting historically is that other states stopped doing this after the war. It was kind of something that came about during the war, but in Kansas, we just kept on going for it. So what we see in Kansas, here are some of the pictures of some of the early inmates at this prison that was in Lansing, Kansas. It was called the Women's Industrial Farm. And in August of 1917, at the beginning of the month, they started with 18 inmates. This was the only women's prison in the state, and that was a pretty typical population. So within a few weeks, they had 200 inmates. By the end of the year, they had 400. So they mass influx of women during the war. They threw up tents. They really had to accommodate all this huge influx of women. But they did get federal funding to build permanent facilities there, and it turned into a large institution. So how Chapter 205 worked, because it wasn't actually a criminal charge, it was a quarantine charge, women didn't receive a trial or anything. They just had to have a positive test result to be sent to the farm. And they were actually sent under indefinite sentences until they were physically and morally cured, both of which were actually pretty subjective at the time because we didn't actually have penicillin until World War II. So these weren't really diseases that were curable. In practice, though, the women averaged sentences around 4 months who were sent there. So I've talked about this as being a prison, and it was a prison. We had women who were sent there under charges of murder and theft and things like that. But it was also a hospital, so the women who were sent there did receive treatment. So between the world wars, the women sent there under Chapter 205 averaged around 71% of the population at the farm. So they did receive treatment that was in line with best practices at the time. And it also was a working farm, as well as that picture that I had up at the very beginning showed. Part of the idea behind this institution was to try to reform women, especially women that a lot of the women that were targeted with Chapter 205. The idea was, let's catch women before they go all the way down the road to prostitution and reform them and get them on the right path. And part of this was teaching them the value of hard work. So it was they had cows and chickens and grew potatoes and did all that kind of stuff there. So when you read a lot of the state documents about these women, they a lot of times refer to them as being, or hint that they are prostitutes. And that certainly was the case for some of them. But as I got further into this research, I realized that really was not the case for a lot of these women. So one question I had as I learned more about this was, how the heck did the police and health officers find out these women had diseases to begin with? So I'll summarize this so you don't have to read that text. Might be a little hard to read. But so one thing I looked at was, as the inmates came to the farm, the staff did interviews with them that had really hilariously loaded questions like, what was the cause of your moral downfall? And at what age did you first break the law of chastity? Were actual questions on the form. But as part of this, they described how they came to be arrested. So I looked at a little under 500 of these interviews, and you can see one category here, this bigger, the biggest one, are targeted arrests. So this is where somebody would turn somebody into authorities as somebody that should be looked into to whether they have disease or not. Sometimes these were parents who were concerned about daughters that they thought were out of control and they couldn't really get them to listen. One particularly problematic theme that several women reported was that it was husbands that turned them in particularly problematic forms of that were, my husband is the only person I've ever had sex with. He cheated on me, gave me syphilis, then we got in a fight and he turned me in, which several women reported a story similar to that. The next category, if you kind of group all these smaller ones together, we can think about those as just routine encounters with the law. So this is during the era of Prohibition, so maybe somebody was in a boarding house that was raided for liquor, or one woman reported that she was in a car and the batteries ran out, so the headlights went out and the police stopped to help them. Or they were with someone that was arrested. And what happened whenever women came into contact with the police, especially if this was particularly targeted at poor women and women of color, if they were in any way deemed suspicious, they would be tested for disease. And so these routine encounters routinely led to women being sent to the prison in Lansing, whereas the men that they were with were set free. The last category I want to talk about briefly is this 20%. And this was a real surprise to me. As I started going through the interviews, I kept seeing on the form, volunteer, volunteer. And 20% of the women who went to the farm actually volunteered to go there. The woman on the screen here was a 45-year-old mother of 7. I don't know if you can see it very well, but she has some facial deformities. That's due to advanced stage syphilis. These diseases were not pretty during this period, and if gone untreated, they could be very serious. So some estimates at the time found that a year's worth of treatment for syphilis, which involved weekly injections of some pretty nasty chemicals, was out of the price range of about 80% of the US population. So Kansas's approach to public health, they didn't invest through most of this period in a lot of free health clinics and things like that. So there were many women whose only option to access health care for these diseases was to actually submit themselves to imprisonment by going to this farm. So this is where you see some of the differences in social class coming up in how this was implemented. So when we think about what is the legacy of World War I for Kansas, with Chapter 205, we find that something that got implemented during the war became kind of standard operating procedure for several decades afterwards, which had a lot of implications for gender relations in the state, understandings of women's sexuality, and also just as a public health issue. You know, obviously, if you just think about it for about 2 minutes and you realize if you're detaining women but not men, you're probably not doing a whole lot to actually solve the spread of syphilis and gonorrhea in the state. So this trend continued through the 20s and 30s. The number of women that were detained under Chapter 205 dropped precipitously during World War II, and not because anyone had some great moral recognition that this was problematic, but because penicillin became widely available, and all of a sudden these were diseases that were pretty easily treatable. There were some women that were detained at much lower numbers after that. The latest one that I found was as late as 1956. So I think this is an important piece of Kansas history, that we recognize that our state detained over 5,000 women for having a venereal disease. So hopefully you do too, and thank you for coming out today.
Good afternoon. Like Dr. Wood introduced me, my name is Holden Zimmerman, and before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Laurie Van Sheena again for inviting me to speak here, and Dr. Wood for that really heartwarming introduction. My topic today is entitled, oh, that's not my presentation. Cool. My presentation today is titled Dropping Right In from Hell to Heaven, Intern Soldiers in Switzerland During World War I. This is part of my senior honors thesis for my history major. About 1.5 years ago, I had a history course in which our focus was World War I. And when I was selecting a project for that assignment, I wanted something that I could use my French and German language skills in. But also, I've always really been interested in Switzerland and the history of human rights and humanitarianism. So I really wanted something that combined all of my interests. And I lived in Switzerland for 1 year while I studied abroad there, and I was always very curious as to why Switzerland is the home of the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I conducted this research project to kind of find some answers to those questions. To give you some background, during World War I, the Swiss state interned around 30,000 British, German, French, and Belgian soldiers. Internment is very different than a prisoner of war camp. They would take prisoners of war from France, Germany, Britain, and so forth, and bring them into Switzerland and put them up in hospitals and hotels and sanatoria. Now that doesn't really sound like a camp that we generally think about, especially not in the German-speaking world. Internment camps in Switzerland are uniquely humanitarian in character. My thesis advances that internment camps in Switzerland during World War I are functioning off of what I call defensive humanitarianism, a diplomatic platform advanced by the Swiss state in order to deal with the unique Swiss problems in World War I. These problems include their international issues of seeing Belgium, a fellow neutral state, invaded, and worrying that that invasion could happen to Switzerland as well if neutrality was not being respected. Domestic issues. There was quite a bit of internal conflict between the French-Swiss and German-Swiss speakers. A lot of Francophones were more how do I want to say this? They supported France pretty heavily, and the German speakers supported Germany. And the Swiss state was really concerned with this because the Swiss state wanted the Swiss population to support the Swiss state. In addition to the political concerns, the Swiss economy was doing very poorly during World War I, primarily a tourism economy. They were not getting their normal ski crowds in to their hotels and hostels. And so the Swiss government and Swiss military wanted to find a solution to these myriad of problems. They were assisted by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which had been formed in Geneva in 1863, as well as the Vatican. Now, these international organizations are very humanitarian in character, and they wanted from the onset of the war to reduce the human suffering of the conflict. And so the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Vatican had in 1914 begun attempting to offer good offices or diplomatic help by a neutral party to the belligerent states to come up with treaties to alleviate the suffering of specifically prisoners of war. Now, these weren't going very well. At that time, there was no precedent for a supranational or NGO to come in and kind of offer these good offices. That had always been done by a nation. And so with the International Committee of the Red Cross's connection with the Swiss state kind of stepped in and acted in the position of those good offices to offer the diplomatic help to help the belligerent states kind of come to an agreement on what to do about prisoners of war and how to enforce the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. So my paper kind of follows a format of, it begins as a diplomatic history. I start with before World War I with the Geneva Convention of 1864 and the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. And I follow that into the treaty deliberations that created the internment camp system in 1915 that led to the internment camp system being implemented in 1916 through 1920. And then my third chapter focuses on the individual lives of the internees from 1916 to about 1920 when the last internees were returned home. I think it's really important to focus on both the diplomatic and social aspects of the internment camp system because while defensive humanitarianism is one concept, but it comes from two terms. It's defensive in the fact that it's about national security of the Swiss state, and it's about their political and economic concerns, but it's also about humanitarianism. It's about improving the condition of these POWs' lives, and while at the same time legitimating the internment of belligerent soldiers in the Swiss state. So over my year and a half of research, I'm continually surprised by what I find. A couple weeks ago, I was doing some research and found an article from a Scottish publication of a curling tournament that was held between some British internees and a Swiss women's team of curlers. And the freedoms allowed to the intern soldiers always has really struck me as amazing because studying POW camps in any conflict is not a healthy place. It is not a fun place. It's not somewhere where you can really engage in much recreational practices, if any. And in the internment camp system, there was a huge focus on health. And health came in many forms. It came in physical health and it came in mental health. And the Swiss state saw mental health as particularly influenced by idleness. So the Swiss state was particularly concerned with idle soldiers and the mental and physical issues that could come from being idle. And so they classified all soldiers into 6 categories based on if they could work or not. So the most healthy soldiers would work 4 days a week. And then it would go down from there. Soldiers who had previously been in university before internment were allowed to attend universities in Switzerland in the largest cities like Geneva and Zurich and Bern. And soldiers who could no longer return to their previous wartime professions, for example, they were a carpenter and they lost an arm, could be retrained in classes. So it was the purpose for the government mostly was to ensure Swiss security and their sovereignty and their borders. But the human impact of it was far greater than that. The work that the International Red Cross and the Swiss military did for these men is, it saved a lot of their lives. The reason my paper is titled Dropping Right In From Hell to Heaven, that is a direct quote from a British soldier who was born outside of London, who was moved from a German POW camp into Switzerland. I'm gonna end a couple minutes early because we're running slow. Thank you very much.
All right, hello, let me see if I can get this presentation back. Thank you. Maybe I got it. Perfect. All right. All right, so while I'm getting this set up, I'll just kind of introduce my topic a bit. So, like Professor Wood said, my name is Matt Dunne, and I'm an undergraduate student here at the University of Kansas studying history. Holden and I are in the same class. So getting ready to defend these theses in April. So that'll be a fun time. Okay, so just a little background. My presentation is titled The Lion, the Rooster, and the Union, the Belgian clandestine press from 1914 to 1918. But in my conclusion, I'll go a little bit beyond that and discuss the legacy of what this all meant. So the clandestine press in Belgium was, it began just after the German invasion in August of 1914. So as soon as the Germans invaded Brussels, they immediately set up censorship laws, which not a single Belgian publisher agreed to continue publishing under. Within the first few days of the German invasion, clandestine publications supporting Belgian identity had already started popping up on the other side of the front as the Germans advanced through Belgium. But it wasn't until February that the biggest publisher began publishing the most widely circulated publication of the war. So in order to kind of give you an idea of how dangerous this was and how important this was to the Belgian citizens, people who were caught with the publications could be sent to internment camps in Germany, which were not in Switzerland. They didn't get the luxurious life over there. But one of the distributors was actually executed by the Germans with Nurse Edith Cavell, if you've heard of her. She was taken by her story was kind of taken by the Western press and made into a huge deal because she was just a humanitarian who wanted to help soldiers on both sides, but the Germans executed the head of publications for La Libre Belgique, which I'll discuss in a minute, alongside her. So in order to give you kind of an idea about the identities in Belgium, if this will work. Okay. It's important to establish a little bit of background on Belgium and the two nations. So Belgium is a state with a federal government comprised of two independent nations, I call them, just because nations is kind of an imagined community, is based on the definition I'm working from. So they're the Flemish in the north and the Walloons in the south. So the Flemish speak Dutch, Walloons speak French. They've had a bit of a contentious history. Belgium was only created as a state since 1830 was when it was officially created. The Belgians revolted against the Netherlands and created their own state. So, but before that, the Prohibition Revolution of 1789 actually created the United Belgian States, which I only recently found out about. And the Spencer Archives has an extensive collection of pamphlets from that time, actually, which is really interesting. But this was the first instance that I found of a cohesive Belgian identity, where people were identifying as Belgians, saying, writing poetry, supporting Belgium and their Belgian identity. But Flanders and Wallonia had some sort of established identity in the case of Flanders, for centuries. They fought at the beginning of the 1300s against the French under the Flemish banner, and that was kind of one of the first instances of a coherent Flemish identity, whereas the Walloons in the territory that is now Wallonia, they kind of gravitated more towards their city and the areas surrounding the cities. So there wasn't as much of an identity for the Walloons historically. But both sections were very Catholic and had both exchanged hands many times. It was kind of like a European tug of war over Belgium for a lot of centuries with the Austrians, the Spanish, the Netherlands, the French. But that's the background on the identity. So moving into the clandestine press, how do you foster a Belgian identity to repel the German invasion? So the Germans, this was a distinctly non-violent form of resistance, which I think is important to highlight. They weren't advocating for the open rebellion against the Germans. They were advocating for civil, just kind of piecemeal wherever you can, not cooperating with the Germans, making it more difficult for them to kind of engage in their everyday activities. And two newspapers I want to highlight are La Libre Belgique and the Vlaams Bleu. So each one of these were, they've promoted a Belgian identity, distinctly Belgian identity, in both Flemish and French. So that's important to note because they were appealing to both halves of the Belgian community that they're trying to establish. And in the background is something called Flammenpolitik, which was the German occupiers' attempts to divide Belgians on those national lines. So they were doing things like trying to change a university that had traditionally spoken French to one that spoke Dutch to appeal to the Flemish movement and more Flemish extremists who either wanted to declare independence from Belgium or wanted to join Germany in some cases. So as the New York Times article shows, the invasion happened against a very tense political background. Okay, so defining a nation. I've kind of touched on this already, but for the purposes of this research, I'm using Benedict Anderson's theory in Imagined Communities. So I'm focusing especially on the part of print capitalism, so the role that newspapers have in fostering an identity, in this case that is a pan-Belgian identity. It's not appealing to a Flemish identity or a Walloon identity unless it's saying we all need to come together as Belgians to repel the Germans. So I mentioned a little bit about the identities within Flanders and Wallonia already, but those come from the religious community and the dynastic realm. Religious community, I mentioned, both were extremely Catholic throughout a majority of their history. And the dynastic realm, Flanders was under dukes, and both areas were under French rule for much of the last millennium. But Flanders was constantly under a Duke of Flanders for the most part, whereas I mentioned Wallonia had more. They gravitated more towards cities. So during the war, constructing a pan-Belgian identity. So the pillars of pan-Belgian identity that I've kind of established for the purposes of this research are Roman Catholicism, the Crown, and anti-German sentiments. So this excerpt highlights the Crown and anti-German sentiments wonderfully. So they often published a lot of things that, like I mentioned, appealed to both Flanders and Walloons, Flemish people and Walloons. And specifically, they wanted to counteract German Flammenpolitik, and that all of those methods that they had of dividing Belgians, which the Germans tried to implement just because it would make it easier for them to govern the country. Only the Governor General, who was the kind of governor of the German governor of Belgium during the war, actually had any real idea of annexing Belgium into Germany. For the most part, the German High Command and Chancellor only wanted to have it as kind of a territory where you could take resources from, and more of a colony than actual annexation. All right, so the legacy. My research has shown me that they were largely successful in fostering pan-Belgian identities, so thousands of these newspapers circulated clandestinely throughout the war, and the La Libre Belgique circulated from 1915 until the very end in 1919, when they announced victory, and this is an excerpt from that final publication. So that identity was all well and good during the war, but without the German catalyst, having an occupier in your country, my thesis is kind of being adapted to say that was kind of the catalyst for a reason for a pan-Belgian identity. After the war, a Flemish movement regained traction and started making gains in Parliament, and especially in the 1920s and 30s. So then, by the 1940s, it had been taken over by the more extreme, what we would refer today as populist form of the country, or of the party, and then that set the stage for 1940, 1944. They decided to kind of readopt those, the gains that they made under Fleming Politik in World War I to hopefully make more concessions and be able to gain more autonomy for Flanders. So, and then if you've recently heard, 2010 to 2011, the Belgian government went without a governing coalition for 580 some days. They set the record for that. So these issues have divided Belgium since its creation in 1830 and are still lasting today. And by analyzing how a national identity can be developed, that can give us more insight into kind of what is going on in today's politics. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, panelists, for your stimulating presentations. I look forward to just helping to coordinate the questions that we have from this large audience here. Who'd like to go first? Yes, please. Oh, wait, we've got a microphone coming.
I guess Holden or Matt, either of you, just for clarification for me, both mentioned human rights and humanitarianism. And I know that to be like something that we used in the English vernacular after World War II and really hadn't come up that way in the research, the time period that you were doing. What do you say about this in your research? How is it described? Is it described as human rights? You're kind of predating that time period. So just for clarification, either one of you?
I'll take this one. So yeah, my interests are in human rights, but that's not something that I'm talking about in this paper. I'm specifically focusing on humanitarianism, which is not always used in that word, but it is a word that I have found in my research. It specifically by the International Committee of the Red Cross and by Henry Dunne, who is the kind of the founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And so I'm sorry for the confusion on the term human rights, but it is a term that comes up, but it's usually framed in words of reducing human suffering and the like.
Yes, Professor Denning.
Hi, thank you all for some great presentations. I have a question that sort of pulls a through line through all of the presentations except for Matt's, but you know that I have other questions for you. So I'm curious why it is that we see in all of these different contexts, why is it that this war that is so destructive of not only lands and materiel, but also human bodies, why is one of the major outcomes of this war this sort of refocusing on human health? It's really striking, this focus on the body and health, mentally and physically, that comes out of this. I'm curious if I could get you guys to riff a bit on why this might be.
I'll take a first stab at that. So, looking at the case of the women's industrial farm in the national context, I think that the thing that ties it, Kansas was unique in focusing on venereal disease, but other states also had this approach of trying to imprison particularly young women and reform them before they went down the path to prostitution. So the charge in Kansas was more focused on the body in that it was focused on venereal disease, but other states might use really loosely defined charges like vagrancy or lascivious conduct or something to detain a lot of women. So it was very much focused on, for my case, I think it was really focused on women's sexuality and the hyper-focus on sexuality for women's deviance. And just in Kansas, that manifested itself in the form of this, the legal mechanism was this law about venereal diseases.
I might give at least two answers to that question. I think in my research, and I touched on this just briefly at the beginning, I think that physical education or student health had kind of established itself as foundationally part of the collegiate experience, and the experience of the war, you know, just drove that home. So I think that that comes out of it, but I don't think it can be separated from nationalism. Part of what was going on in the football stadium was preparing for the next war, and making sure that American, largely boys or men, were going to be able to win the next war. You know, I think that the U.S. was feeling perhaps in a different way about its position internationally at the close of the war and the outcomes of the war, and but it doesn't. But that's also tied to the things that came before with Teddy Roosevelt, muscular Christianity, etc. Even dating back into the. There's a lot written about as the. You know, the myth of individualism, and that, you know, you're going to start as a clerk and you're going to be the CEO of the company one day, and that is erased in the post-Civil War era, that college and a degree kind of takes the place of that. And so again, that American masculinity tied into sport. You know, you even see it written in certain spaces that going to college was about getting a business degree and having at least a touch of the manly sports, of football primarily. And so I think that physical education had established itself as part of the collegiate experience and had gained some credibility and a holistic view of what you would gain from college, one, and two, that the U.S. was, you know, not explicitly gearing up for something they could see but could feel, you know, in the future. And so outdoor sports, football, part of that was part of making sure that the future soldiers would be up to the task in a way.
As far as my answer to that question goes, I think World War I, you see a lot of new diseases cropping up. So you see trench foot for a physical disease. You see widespread tuberculosis among specifically POWs. But also you see the emergence of what they were calling back then barbed wire disease, which is what we pretty much call PTSD now. And so I think the first goal of the Swiss internment camps was the humanitarian goal of removing them from the war zone, from these POW camps where the sanitation was so low. But once they moved them into Switzerland, I think with Swiss sanatoria and the health practices of that area and the ideas of what health was, I think the Swiss focus on idleness and not being stationary and occupying both your body and your mind says a lot about how they thought about the use of time and the use or disuse of the body for your physical health.
I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to add one more thing. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. This is also a period when we see the rise, in the post-war era, you see the rise of the KKK nationally and the eugenics movement. And I think that at least in my research, football, outdoor sports, the stadium building movement was partially about white supremacy and making certain that physically that white Americans, white collegiate Americans could maintain superiority over people of different races or ethnicities or what have you. You see that a lot. And at KU, and I'm sure people are familiar with the research of Bill Tuttle, Professor Emeritus American Studies History at KU, sometimes in talks he's given, I know he's touched on the KUs, which was a Klan group at the university who have photos in our yearbooks, the Jayhawker from about 1919 to maybe 1924, who had official roles in the football stadium as cheerleaders. And so the health movement is tied into that as well for in maintaining or the illusion of white supremacy.
Yes, please. Right. Let's get the microphone coming.
Thinking about the parallel with the women's suffrage movement and women getting the right to vote in 1920, I'm wondering if your disproportionate number of women being locked up makes me wonder if part of it was about controlling women, period.
Actually, there's a very interesting twist to that. So actually, a part of my research I didn't talk about today was the Women's Industrial Farm as a separate women's prison was actually established in that same legislative session. They were separate issues. But Kansas women actually were some of the first women to gain the right to vote in statewide elections. And so from the time that Kansas women got the vote in 1912, and there was a coalition of women's clubs and organizations in the state, and one of their top priorities leading up till the time that they were successful in 1917 was actually to establish a separate women's prison in Kansas. And so they actually lobbied to create the Women's Industrial Farm. And part of this was because the women before that were housed in the men's prison and were subjected to sexual abuse and things like that. So an interesting piece of my research is looking at the relationships between different groups of women, because the women that lobbied, they spent, it was kind of like their prime political capital right after they got the vote. This is one of the main things they lobbied for. And they were pretty much silent after it immediately got turned into this institution to detain women for venereal disease. And I think this, tying in with Howard's comments about eugenics and part of some of the other issues that they lobbied for, they were pro-sterilization laws. There were a lot of things like this. So part of their motivation for creating the prison was to help reform women. So the divisions between women are really interesting. And actually part of the legislation to establish the farm said that women had to be in charge of the prison. So there was also a group of female professional social workers who ran the farm, who talked a lot about how these women needed to be morally reformed and defended this practice. So yes, there was a lot of anxiety about gender roles and a lot of anxiety about youth sexual culture during this time. But actually some of other women in the state were part of the apparatus that was supporting imprisoning these women. So those divisions along lines of race and class were important as well.
Yes, please, right here in the front.
Well, first of all, these were all great areas of research. But Nicole, I'm into history and I'm a healthcare practitioner, and I've never heard that story before. And it made me think, going back to the comment on tuberculosis, but I knew a little bit how tuberculosis was handled in terms of quarantine methods and so forth. And it seemed like that was handled more as like in a healthcare environment versus you're talking about more of sexually transmitted diseases handled in a prison environment. Did you kind of look at the similarities and differences of both of those?
Not exactly, but part of what I looked at, so during World War I, there were a lot of federal resources going into the fight against venereal diseases. So there were actually officers from the National Public Health Service who came So initially, the Women's Industrial Forum had a lot of resources. So they had social workers. They actually had a social worker go undercover at the farm to try to discover the roots of young female delinquency. So they had a lot of resources at first. And at that point, their efforts were really more integrated with the State Board of Health, which is really where it should. So the Board of Health actually had a separate division for venereal disease control. After World War I ended, though, those national resources stopped coming, and with it, the staffing and the purpose to do this more intentionally were really gone, and what was left was this apparatus to imprison women who were perceived as sexually active. So there are entire years where the State Board of Health reports don't even mention the fact that the state is detaining hundreds of women for having disease. And it's really run through the government organization that was in charge of the prisons. So it really shifted from being, initially there was more of a public health focus and more of an idea of trying to get at a comprehensive way of understanding the social problem. This was part of the progressive movement where people were really trying to think we could tackle some of the social problems that before people thought were just inevitable. A lot of optimism about the promise of having social science to help us understand these things. But those resources just disappeared, and it really became just a punitive thing.
Yes, please, in the second row here.
I would posit that a lot of the emphasis on public health is because this was during the nascent period of public health and public sanitation, pure food and drug, indoor plumbing is all evolving during this period. I think if you look at the casualty reports, you'll find that there are more casualties or deaths in service from disease than there were from wounds. And certainly the Civil War, and I think at least as late as World War I, there were more people off duty from venereal disease than there were from wounds.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question.
Regarding the stadiums, so I just moved here from the East Coast, so I know the stadium at the University of Pennsylvania very well, and also Princeton. So what is the oldest stadium that's in use right now? Are those in the mix?
That's a really that's a really good question. I'm certain it's in the Ivy League, but I'm not certain which stadium is still in use. That's been kind of outside of my purview because those Ivy League stadiums those schools are not FBS schools, those are FCS schools, which stands for football. It's like championship. I can't remember but they have a tournament and a championship. So those would be the Ivy League schools, Patriot League schools, those type of schools. So I'm certain that it is there. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Haskell Indian Nations University and their football stadium, which the arch is a memorial arch, and it was, I think, completed in the mid-20s, maybe 1926, but it's historic because it's the first stadium west of the Mississippi with lights. It's the first stadium to have a game under the lights. But I'm not certain. We can probably look that up together right now. But I do think that it is on the East. It's definitely on the East Coast, but I'm not certain which stadium it is. Thanks for the question.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for these fantastic papers. It's really interesting to see the connection of nationalism and the way that nationalism is inflected by the war. It's interesting to see, as Professor Denning drew our attention to, attitudes towards health and the body and the way that this comes through. And I think a question that I often ask myself about World War I is, to what extent can we see the war as an accelerant of things that were already happening beforehand? To what extent can we see the war as perhaps a perversion of developments that were already happening? Or did contemporaries see it that way? And to what extent does it really just change the direction altogether? And those are the big questions that I find myself asking, and each of these papers today helped me to think about those. For example, Matt's paper about this national trajectory, which seems to have found a moment of coalescence when there was a common enemy, and then the national storyline, not the state, but the national storyline prevailed. So all of these papers gave me much to think about. Please join me in thanking our panelists. There are desserts, refreshments just right outside. Thank you all so much for coming.